Hi, everyone. Welcome to just another episode of Conversations with Coaches. Today, I'm very excited to welcome Ingrid Balogh, and we'll talk about resilience coaching. Ingrid, it's a pleasure to meet you, and I'd like you to introduce yourself to the audience.
Thank you, Luba. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the invite. It's lovely to be here. So my name is Ingrid Balogh. I'm a certified co-active coach. And I have been coaching for 10 years now. 9 years of that as a freelancer. I started back in the day when I still had a full-time job. I have a corporate background, so I come from the corporate environment. I had about 15 years in organizations, in roles varying through customer service management and project management and supply strategy. So it was a diverse career, but within supply chain. And yeah, I've started my corporate career in Hungary at the time in Budapest, and then I ended it in Thailand in Bangkok. I have left my corporate career because of a big burnout that I had at the time, and yeah, there was not so much awareness about burnout and these topics in general back in the day, and also maybe in the circles that I was in very traditional corporate environments. So basically, my exit was my coach training. I did my coach training, and then I left my job, and I felt immediately that I found my calling with the coaching. So I moved back to Europe, recovered from the burnout, which took some time, and then I very slowly started building my business. Yeah, and I'm based in Europe now. I'm based between Switzerland and Hungary, and that's in a nutshell for now.
Thanks for sharing. What inspired you to coach around resilience? Is this something that you originally wanted to do, or did you notice this in your clients' request and then the niche naturally emerged for you?
Yeah, it's a great question for me because I have never been really um, settled down on a specific niche, as opposed to many coaches who start off with a niche. And anyway, from a marketing point of view, that's the big saying that the more you can niche yourself down, the more easier it becomes to grow your business. But for me, it just didn't go like that. For the longest time, I really wasn't keen on narrowing down my focus. I've started originally coaching clients who were at the time very similar to me. So they wanted also to exit from the corporate environment. So that was my first organic clients, somehow drawn to my story at the time. And then as I also recovered from my burnout, somehow organically started to pay more attention onto the corporate space again. So I returned sort of to the corporate space through coaching. I started coaching people, managers, leaders in the corporate space. And several years into this practice, one of the patterns that I started realizing is that, well, I was coaching many women anyway, because women anyway tend to come, more into coaching, into personal development. But the pattern that I was noticing was that no matter where we are, in which continent, no matter which ethnicity, which cultural background, which religion, women somehow tend to face the very similar challenges across the globe. And so I found that fascinating, and it sort of turned my attention more consciously towards coaching women in leadership. And then very organically, burnout comes up in that space. Somehow women, we are maybe a little bit more prone to eventually going into burnout. And so that was part of that, coaching in that space. And eventually, again, organically. So you see, my journey is very organic in this sense. I started learning a little bit about resilience. Somehow this word started popping up. I think resilience just as a word and as a concept started becoming more trendy, more known in the past several years. And eventually in 2023, I took a training on resilience, which really opened up my perspective on and understanding on what resilience is. Um, but even more so, what it made me realize is that everything that I have been doing in coaching up until that moment, in leadership, in coaching women, was really overall connected very much with resilience. Everything we do is eventually connected to resilience. There's nothing, no topic, no challenge that doesn't involve resilience somehow. And so it was really matching really well with what I have been doing anyway up until that moment. So it was very organic, but then I made very conscious choices of using these words and using a certain language so as to make it clear that this is the space that I'm interested in coaching. I don't know if that answers your question because that's niche, but not so much from a marketing point of view, but eventually it all works out for me in this way.
Thank you for sharing your story. I think as a coach educator, I very often meet coaches who are confused about the choice of niche and even the whole idea of niching. And there are many questions around whether the niche should originate from their professional experience prior to coaching, or whether this is something they need to be 100% clear on, whether they can stay generalist, whether they can allow their niche to transform and shift. So by sharing your journey, I think you are normalizing the fact that it can be a very emergent process, which I hope gives some reassurance to many professionals. However, I do want to come back to one of the statements that you shared, since we're talking about resilience coaching today. You said that everything comes back to resilience. And I find this very interesting because as someone who's involved in psychometrics and someone who's done research, just to see what different concepts including resilience, by the way, I know that for many people, when they say, for example, emotional intelligence, most likely they mean emotional regulation, but emotional intelligence is so much more than regulation, right? Similarly, when people say resilience, they might mean just one thing, but resilience as a concept itself, as a construct, it may include a dozen of smaller concepts. So how do you like what do you mean by resilience? What are some elements of resilience that you work with?
So for me, resilience, and this is why it all happened very organically for me because resilience for me means sustainability. So the word sustainability comes really up for me when I talk about resilience, and that is also the same word that comes up for me when I talk about leadership. So all my leadership coaching is largely about what is sustainable? How can we make leadership sustainable, as in not burn out or not over push the boundaries or not overheat the engine that we are running with, right? And that's exactly the same for resilience as well. But that's because they are really on the same coin, like maybe the two sides of the same coin. So for me, it's all about sustainability and resilience for me means the capacity for our resourcefulness. And when we say resourcefulness, then what I mean is the very diverse, many different resources that we all have within us to different extents. But the point is the diversity and which resource do I need to tap into, which resource do I need to utilize for a specific challenge or for a specific situation. For me, that's resilience. That is what gives us the flexibility that resilience actually means. Resilience officially means the capacity, the ability to bounce back from challenges, from difficult situations. Um, One of the misunderstandings about resilience, and I see that showing up over and over again, is that resilience means just pushing through difficult times or just, powering through all the challenges or the bad days. And that's the misunderstanding itself, that resilience somehow equals willpower or endurance. And that's not true. Resilience includes willpower and endurance and persistence, but it's just a very small, like a tiny slice of a big pizza that includes so many other slices and flavors. Like you mentioned emotional intelligence. In resilience, the resource for resilience and also the manifestation of resilience is our emotional capacity that will include our ability to recognize emotions, to understand what is going on with us in any given moment, and the ability to respond based on those emotions in an adequate manner without overreacting or underreacting. So there is a lot of the regulation that you mentioned in this and more. So, and that as well is just one slice of resilience. Then our capacity to solve things, as in not necessarily just problems, but challenges, navigate complex environments. Which resource do I need to pull in order to navigate a specific environment or challenge? So, so you're right that there are so many myths and misunderstandings about resilience that actually resilience coaching inevitably has to include some level of education.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you so much for sharing. This is amazing, super insightful. So I really like the pizza metaphor
Mhm.
that you used to describe resilience, and I can relate to this. So what are those slices of the resilience pizza that, in your experience, your clients would most often like to work around?
Mhm.
Like, what are
So,
some common or popular topics
mhm.
around resilience?
Yeah, and that's a very interesting question because I have to say that nobody ever comes to coaching to say, I want to work on resilience or I want to grow my resilience. That's just not, at least not in my coaching. Maybe for other people, yes, but not in my experience. And that's because everybody has their own experience and language to express what they are struggling with. And we as human beings, we don't think about, oh, I have this challenge now, so I want to work on my resilience. No, people come with, I have this challenge and I want to work on this challenge. And eventually, as we start working on either on the topic or on the bigger, maybe abstract area that they bring in, then inevitably we are working with resilience. So um, I want to
Could you
become a
maybe
better
give
man.
some practical examples
Yeah.
to make it more relatable, to be a bit more specific, so that people who listen to this, they can understand what scenarios you're talking about? Of course,
Mhm.
make sure to maintain confidentiality as
Confidentiality, yeah.
required.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So these are quite general examples, actually. They are very overwhelmingly present for many people. Um, how to become a better manager? Yeah, that's a leadership topic. It's a leadership question. But when we are working with that, we are mostly working with identity. Who do I want to become? inevitably we are working with where do we start from? So what's the gap we need to close? And with that, we are inevitably touching on parts of resilience. For example, how do I build relationships? Are my relationships authentic? Am I able to ask for help? Um, am I creative in the sense of not labeling myself as only rational or only artistic, but am I able to work with the range of creative, rational, and the whole spectrum? Do I have a vision? Do I have a purpose? How connected I am to that vision, especially as a leader, especially when I'm working with, who I want to become as a manager. So that's already going through the whole spectrum of the pizza, basically. Another big topic that I work with is how do I create more balance in my life, right?
Okay.
How do I create more balance, more presence? Many people come with this more well-being, yeah. And then there we inevitably have to look at lifestyle, health, habits. Um, the emotional resilience part is part of the picture almost for every topic, for every person, because many of our coping mechanisms, patterns create certain emotional responses and behavioral responses that we look at and sort of work through in coaching. So these are two big, quite general topics. The how do I become a manager? How do I create more well-being or mindfulness or presence in my life? And then often people come with very specific challenges, like how do I navigate a difficult conversation, whether it's a feedback conversation with somebody in my team, or whether it's a conflict, disagreement in a meeting or with stakeholders. How do I navigate that? How do I take my next step in my career? And these topics on the surface don't look like they are topics that are relating to resilience or well-being as such, but they almost always are. Because whenever we face a challenge, that means that there is some level of stress involved, some degree of stress, and we simply need to utilize certain resources to manage those situations and how to manage such situations in a healthy, balanced way, sustainable way. That's when we talk about resilience.
Ingrid, I actually heard some requests, some coaching requests that mentioned the word resilience specifically. And I remember some of those situations came from a line manager who was discussing some coaching engagements for the team. So basically, it was a GM who wanted me to coach first line managers. And he mentioned that he wanted them not to give up so easily or not to get so upset when something happens. He wanted them to bounce back. And I heard that this was pretty much around resilience. Do people ever come with challenges like this? Do they phrase their challenges in this way in your practice?
The part of like I want to be less upset with certain things. Yes, definitely. Because what happens often, and I think what this manager or this GM might have seen, is when people overreact on certain situations emotionally. But equally, when we're underreacting, that's from a resilience point of view the same thing. It might not have such a visible aspect for the outsider or for the other person, but it's happening internally. So a lot of my clients actually um, come with challenges around how to manage the internal stress that they are feeling. And that brings me to a actually very important point about resilience, that resilience is quite literally how we feel internally. So that's the feeling of, how does life feel like for me? How am I feeling when I go through this challenge or when I work in this team? Am I suffering because of the challenges that I'm facing? Or am I feeling fully equipped to deal with those challenges? And this thing about upset, overreacting, or underreacting, we can be upset internally as well. It's a huge part of what we do in connection with resilience.
Yeah, I can hear that. And how long does this work normally take? Do you work with each client as long as they need it? Do you have, I don't know, like a package? What's the structure of this work? Because I may assume this kind of personalized work, working on someone's internal reactions, may not be a very fast work.
That's right, actually, that's right. So my entire practice, coaching practice, is fundamentally based on working with at least minimum 3 months assignments, coaching assignments, more often even 6 months, and sometimes even 1 year. That's just the way I prefer to work. But when we work specifically with resilience, then that's specifically even needed because you need to have a certain period of time to see changes happening and to see
Exactly.
some new habits or some new mindsets stick and really show up in the practice of life. So I would say a minimum of 3 months is something that's needed for any kind of change to show, and then a bigger transformation might be even a little bit longer time.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think resilience is an attractive concept. And if someone reads a book on resilience or attends a workshop on resilience, this is not going to make them more resilient because it's about the experience, right? It's a lived experience of responding to something in a more resilient way. It's not just the education about resilience. What are some typical client profiles that you work with? Do you only work with leaders?
I generally work with people in the corporate space who are managers at some level, leaders, directors, sometimes also individual contributors, so not necessarily people managers always. But my a lot of my clients, so I would say most of my clients are women, and well, I see them obviously as widely amazing, smart, motivated, ambitious women who they have something in common, and what they have in common is that they are both successful and still working very hard, trying very hard to prove themselves. And more often than not, we find some tiny little voice in the background that says, I'm not good enough, or some version of that. And even though they have already built ample evidence that they are good enough, they are even great, they are successful, and as I said, smart, ambitious, and so on. But there's that paradox, that conflict within, which in my experience, creates what I like to call an internal glass ceiling. So there's success and progression until a certain point, and then this little voice creates that certain fear of failing and fear of not being good enough, that it even prevents these people, these women, to dare to go further in their journey, even though they could and they should. So that's one of the things, that one of the typical profiles that I very much like to work with. And I see over and over again the amazing liberation when we work through some of these internal challenges. That's also a lot about resilience. So that's emotional resilience and self-esteem, self-confidence, and all that.
I love that you
Some of,
mentioned liberation because I wanted
yeah.
to ask you exactly about this. How is success of resilience coaching measured?
Mhm.
What will the client see if they intentionally work on their resilience or different aspects of their resilience with a coach?
Mm-hmm. For me personally, all throughout my coaching career, this is a relatively simple question. And I know this is a big topic, especially in the corporate space where coaching is sponsored. How do we prove the ROI of coaching and how do we measure and so on? For me, in my practice, I find this a simple thing because something that we need to accept is that a lot of what coaching brings is non-tangible. So it's based on how do I feel? Who am I being now versus who I was? What is different now in the way I show up? And those can be articulated with words, not necessarily measured exactly scientifically, right? And once we accept this, then it becomes easy to measure anything in simple ways. For example, scaling from 0 to 10 or 1 to 10. Where on this scale do you feel you are at with this goal or with this challenge that you're facing? And then we check back in midway or at the end and at the end. Now, this is how I operate most of the time, and this goes for topics related to resilience as well. However, in the resilience coaching space, it is possible to measure very specifically and relatively scientifically, I would say. The tool that I have trained in 3 years ago called a personal resilience indicator, for example, is a marvelous psychometric, and it provides the most comprehensive assessment that is currently available on the market, with really fascinating measures on overall resilience and of the areas within resilience. And that's possible to measure at the beginning of an assignment and then after 3 months or after 6 months. So the change would be very visible. I have been using this way of measuring resilience in the past. I have now returned to a more organic way of coaching with resilience and coaching as it comes up in the process, and then also measuring it in this very simple organic way. So that's at least my take on
That's great
measurement.
to know. Thanks for sharing your experience, Ingrid. So you mentioned this specific tool that you are trained in, and you also mentioned the organic way of measuring based on maybe client self-assessment or other people's observations about the changes that they notice in your client if this is a sponsored engagement. So I'm curious, if a coach decides to pick resilience coaching as the niche, what would you suggest them to educate themselves on? How to prepare? Do they need any special training? Do they need any specific tools? Or how would they transition into this niche?
Mhm. Um, that's a good question, and it points me into different directions because I think it depends on how exactly a coach wants to utilize this knowledge about resilience, to what extent. Because I have seen in my experience, I have seen that it is possible to be very focused on coaching very specifically on resilience, and that entails quite a lot of education, educating the client about the concepts, about the framework, including the measurement. And then eventually, if the client is ready, going deep into the topics of resilience and working through towards what they want to work through. So that can be one way to utilize and to work in this space, or in a more organic way, like I have now resolved, in my practice, that leadership and resilience are very connected in my coaching, and it includes some education about resilience, but it's more organic, as in we start working with the client and I introduce either knowledge or resources or concepts as we go, rather than in one package. So I would say that it's definitely important to get some learning, whether that's in the format of listening to resources, reading resources, or a training specifically on resilience. I think that's up to the individual and up to how far, how deep they want to include this into their practice. There's resilience is a very fast growing area. It's not a coincidence that it has become a buzzword or a trend word in the past several years, because most of the research on resilience has been done in the past 2 decades or 15 years or so. So it correlates, it's normal, and I believe it's welcome that it's becoming more and more popular in common understanding of the population. And So there's a lot of information and knowledge now available that one can learn in various different ways. If somebody is quite serious about going into this space, then I think at least that's what I like to do. That at some point then get either a formal training or some kind of an in-depth immersion into the topic.
That's helpful. Thank you so much. What else is important for coaches who coach around resilience? Do you, as a resilience coach, have to be super resilient yourself and lead by example? Or are there any other traits that could help, coaches to work in this area?
Oh, well, an amazing question, and it makes me smile because it speaks very directly to me as well. My belief is that, and this is a broad belief, but also a narrow belief, that all of us who work in the some kind of a helper profession, whether it's psychologists or coaches or therapists, we have some personal motivation to do this work, or some personal story. So we have our own work and our own journey in personal development, and we all work with our personalities as well. We are not excluded from the space when we interact with the client, and clients resonate with our story and with who we are as people, even though we are not sharing our own. That's not what we are talking about in a coaching session, but still energetically we're resonating. And that's why this question is very important. I think that we do need to do our own work, and that applies to resilience as well. I don't believe we have to be at 100% of resilience
Like
in order
unshakable.
to cope.
Right.
Yeah. Equally, as we don't have to be, as a leadership coach, I don't have to be currently, I don't know, a senior executive in a corporation to coach leaders, right? But what more importantly matters, I think, is the awareness uh, of who we are and where we are now, and the awareness also that we are also human and we are all walking this journey together. Maybe some of us are a bit more ahead, and some of us are in a different part of the path. And what I can say about this practically is that when I was using the psychometric, I have measured my own resilience a couple of times, and it can be a widely different number, because resilience is a very dynamic trait. And that's another misunderstanding or myth about resilience, that it is not static. It's not like I'm resilient or I'm not resilient. It can change over time. I mean, that's the good news. That's why we can work with it, that we can grow it, and we can build it. But even with that, it's going to change over time, because our resilience will be different on a day when we haven't slept well, or when we are ill, or when we have some major event going on in our life, versus when we feel in the best shape physically, mentally, emotionally. So the fluctuation is very normal. Yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, no, that's great to hear. When you were saying that it's very human, The word that came to mind was self-compassion. And I think that is quite important to be self-compassionate in order to be more resilient.
Yes.
Because if you are being a kind friend to yourself in the moments when you fall, it's easier to get up and get going again. What do you think?
Yes, absolutely. That's a huge truth about resilience. I couldn't agree more. And that's why actually self-compassion, learning about self-compassion and learning ways to practice self-compassion is a huge part of my coaching almost always. That I can say that that's what most people need more of, for sure.
Yeah, yeah, that's very, very true. We are getting to the end of our time together, and I think that was a very insightful conversation. Is there something that we missed, you think, Ingrid? Is there something important that needs to be mentioned about resilience that we haven't touched upon yet?
Um, Maybe just an addition to the previous question that we touched on, that when I said we all need to do our work, I think that very much applies to resilience equally as it applies to coaching as a profession. Like we know that coaching is a lifelong learning profession. We are also required by the coaching associations to keep up our learning and be at the top of the game. And I think that applies even more so on resilience because it's such a fast changing and a new area that's being researched more and more. And there's more and more data and information and neuroscientific aspects, which, by the way, also impact coaching overall, not just resilience. And maybe just that I think this is now a very good time for anybody to get immersed into the topic of resilience and keep learning about it and keep up to date.
That sounds amazing. And I think it's especially reassuring that it's not just one topic that you'll be working around, right? If you call yourself a resilience coach, most likely you won't have to give up any of the favorite topics that you like coaching around. Most likely they'll be part of resilience in one way or the other. And maybe what you need to do is to be a bit more clear about the language and the connections so that your clients understand the work you are doing and what value they can get from working with you.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Okay. So for everyone who's interested in resilience coaching or working with Ingrid in particular, we'll leave all her contact information in the episode description. So feel free to get in touch, learn more about resilience, or experience the power of coaching yourself. Thank you very much for your time, Ingrid.
Thank you so much. This was absolutely a pleasure. Thank you, Luma.